This department will not rest until we have ended the fentanyl epidemic in America once and for all. In less than 2 months since I took office, the DEA and FBI have seized nearly 1 million deadly doses of fentanyl, and that's just the beginning. At my direction and working with Pam and everybody else, we've launched an all-out war on fentanyl traffickers, and it's a war that we're going to win. We're going to win this war. We're stopping the criminals pouring across our borders at record levels, and we're also stopping the massive quantities of deadly drugs. In 2023 alone, drug overdoses killed more Americans in 12 months than they did during the entire decade between 1980 and 1990, so 10 times more, but it's much higher than that. More Americans died from fentanyl last year than died in the Korean War, or the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, all of them combined. That's why I've placed large tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, and they will remain in place until these deadly poisons stop pouring into our country. And I will tell you, as soon as I put on the tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, unbelievable results have been seen in the last few weeks. Unbelievable results. They weren't happy about it. You probably read they weren't happy, but they are working like hell to end it. They weren't working very hard before I did that.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. Looks like yesterday was the day of independence. I guess independent from what? We never left the UK. Top of the morning to you, London. So, I guess Diddy is going to get a couple of years. It kind of helps when you have James Comey, the ex-FBI guy that was responsible for Russiagate. His daughter was a prosecutor. Looks like he's going to get a pass. And in the news, pay attention to China, the Three Gorges Dam. It is releasing water. Pay attention to this. Those dams are ticking time bombs, and it's that water releasing that's getting so many people in trouble. People are being completely flooded out again. So pay attention to China. My prediction, sadly, is when that dam blows, 40% of the population in China is going to go with it. So pretty serious deal here. And looking around social media recently, it looks like people are really ganging up on other people. Like, for example, in Nebraska, the state that I currently live, people are saying that there was a clinic that closed down here. And they're saying, you deserve this, Nebraska. Look who you voted for. You voted for Trump, and now you're losing your hospital. Well, it seems to me, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but it seems to me there's a lot of people blaming other people versus the ones doing the harm. So that's all I'm going to say for now on that subject. So today I'm going to be talking about eugenics via fentanyl. And why does the USA take so many medications and drugs? The fentanyl story is a fascinating one. I'll give you a few minutes while I'm doing the intro here to guess. I wonder what got fentanyl going. I wonder what kept fentanyl going. Pretty good trick they pulled. So I'll be going into all of that. Also in the news with this big, beautiful bill, private equity has been buying up nursing homes. Medicaid funds a lot of them. So local economies are going to get crushed by getting rid of people's food stamps. So all those people cheering for other people losing their benefits are going to have kind of a rude awakening soon, because local economies depend on those benefits also, the entire economy. So not going to be a good picture coming down the road here. So anyhow, because over 60% of all nursing home residents rely on Medicaid, big problem. And private equity, which I will be getting to later, not today. Private equity is the wolf in charge of all of this, and Medicaid is the largest single payer of long-term care in the U.S. The average cost of a nursing home stay is $7,500 a month. So, and that is not affordable for most without Medicaid. And there's also this issue in this country that I won't get too deep into, that people want to put grandma into nursing homes, and how they do it is they take away her assets and put them into trusts or whatever they do. And that way she will qualify for a subpar Medicaid-funded, private equity-owned nursing home. Good luck surviving, Grandma. You'll be dead in a month or two. So yeah, what people do is they declare Grandma as not having any funds. They wipe out her assets, put them here or there, and so that way they can get the state to pay for Grandma or Mom to live in some substandard kind of place. Yeah, that's how we treat the elderly in this country. But anyhow, so this Medicaid deal is going to have, I mean, massive, massive things. So let's get to the subject of today. Early roots of capitalism, medicine, and race. And isn't it always interesting that here we are back at the 1800s again, huh? Opium and morphine were widely used in the 1800s, especially after the Civil War, when the drug addicts took over. Imagine that. Many veterans were also addicted, and they called it the soldier's disease. Cocaine was actually in Coca-Cola, and heroin was sold as a non-addictive cough remedy. Widespread trauma from wars, industrial accidents, and poor working conditions created a national culture of self-medication. And we also had race-based laws began to emerge. Opium began being criminalized when Chinese immigrants were scapegoated. Cocaine was blamed on black men in the South during Jim Crow. These laws were less about public health and more about social control. We also have the war, addiction, and state control of the 20th century. Trauma, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Veterans return with physical and psychological wounds. Drugs, whether prescribed or illicit, help numb the pain. PTSD was not officially recognized before 1980. Before that, soldiers were expected to tough it out. Yeah, there's always a tough solution for us and an easy one for them, right? And then, according to state power, we first had the Harrison Narcotics Act, 1914, that criminalized many drugs, marking the start of federal drug control. Then there was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. They used fear-based propaganda. Remember that movie Reefer Madness? To target marijuana and minority users. Then, of course, we have the CIA and intelligence agencies. They have been linked to heroin and cocaine trafficking. For example, in Vietnam, we have the Golden Triangle. And, of course, we won't want to forget the Iran-Contra affair, which I will be getting to once I lay the groundwork with today's show. So, then in the 70s, the United States had the war on drugs, which really was the war on people, and that lasted from the 1970s to the 1990s. And that was when the drug addicts in charge of the White House. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant the president. That was when Nixon declared the war on drugs. Later, advisors admitted it was aimed at hippies and black people, not just substances. So, of course, with Vietnam War and the civil unrest, there was a political need to criminalize dissent. In the 1880s to 90s, inner city communities devastated by crack epidemics. And I'm getting back to that way down the road here. And also in that same era, mandatory minimums and 100 to 1 sentencing disparity, crack versus powder cocaine. What they did was they made crack cocaine you go right to jail thing, and powder cocaine had a whole different set of rules. And then we have the CIA crack cocaine links fueled deep mistrust in black communities, and that was all part of that Gary Webb story, which I'll be getting to. And then Big Pharma enters the picture. OxyContin in the 1990s, they trigger the opioid crisis in white, rural, and working class America. They hit the white people with the pills, right? You see this transition here? They went from crack and cocaine, and then they came up with the pills. Pills are easier to produce. They don't require growing poppies and stuff once you get to the pills, and that's where fentanyl is, and I'll be getting there now. So we have the pharmaceutical America, pain, profit, and numbness. We have 9/11, school shootings, economic instability, pandemics, social isolation. America has the highest rate of depression, anxiety, chronic pain, and loneliness. Rather than address root causes, pharmaceutical industries offer numbing solutions, antidepressants, ADHD meds, sleep aids, anti-anxiety pills, and opioids. So, why this fits the United States? Because the American culture emphasizes individual responsibility, not social safety nets, productivity over well being, self reliance, even when it leads to self destruction. Drugs become a quick fix for essential pain in a high pressure society. So it all started, interestingly enough, with the Civil War. The wounded soldiers were given morphine and opium, which created widespread addiction. In the Great Depression and World War II, there were alcohol laws, narcotics, and they tightened controls. Then, of course, in the Vietnam War, we had the mass incarceration of people with Nixon's war on drugs. During the Reagan era, we had the crack cocaine epidemic, policing and prison boom, and racial injustice. Post 9/11, you had fear, surveillance, pandemic trauma, and cannabis and psychedelics, legalization, and new profits. So, yes, it's basically about the trauma. I don't believe any healthy, functioning person, and I'm using that term lightly, would dive headfirst into massive amounts of fentanyl in these drugs. Just does not happen like people think that you don't wake up one day and I'm so happy my whole life that today I'm going to decide to become a drug addict. It just doesn't work that way. So it's numbing of pain and trauma. So, but it's also about power. They use substances to escape physical and emotional pain, but using drug laws to enforce social order and control marginalized groups. They use the pharmaceutical innovation to profit from pain rather than cure it. Nobody ever talks about how to get rid of something, right? Like even with this neuropathy thing that I talked about in the past that you get from this radiation and dirty electricity. No one ever mentions that, gee, just take some magnesium or soak your feet or your hands in some magnesium and neuropathy, no longer an issue, right? They immediately rush to the pills. Well, that's because people are also demanding those pills. So this street really runs two ways, right? I'm not saying that everybody's a victim. We're a victim of a nation of victims. I'm just trying to explain how possibly we became a culture of people who saw taking drugs as a good thing to do, right? I mean, if you caught Trump yesterday talking on the 4th of July, well, I mean, if that man was sober, I would be shocked, okay? He was meandering all around, clearly very high on some sort of speed, right? Adderall or whatever, but he was high. So we have leaders of this country exhibiting some pretty bad abuse, right? We have RFK Jr. was a heroin addict. So yeah, the people in charge are also drug addicts themselves. So likely they don't see much wrong with any of this, right? So let's take a look at the rankings per other countries, and it's a addiction per 100,000, and the United States is the highest globally. They have over 1,000. Other countries have like numbers like Canada has 600 to 700, Australia 400 to 500, UK 2 to 300, but the United States has 1,000, the highest globally. So the U.S. leads due to overprescription, fentanyl flooding, and poor addiction infrastructure. And I'm not going to really get into all the alcohol and stuff because this really isn't a drug meetup. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork for where I'm going with this fentanyl business. So, interestingly enough, smoking is way down this country. That's one thing that's down. It's like 12% down sharply, but yeah. But vaping has surged, and we also have lung cancer on the rise. So, he explained to me what smoking has anything to do with it. So, yeah, so The United States ranks higher than any other country. It ranks higher than Russia, Canada, Australia. Yeah, we're the highest. Also high, right? So, what are the root causes? Well, we have an aggressive pharmaceutical industry with opioid overprescription, ADHD meds, profit-driven healthcare, encourages drug treatment over root causes, criminalization over treatment, focus on punishment instead of healing, high rates of trauma, loneliness, PTSD, poverty, and mental health issues. And a lot of this just happens by surrounding environments, because imagine if you're a person that's working to make ends meet with your family and you envision that everybody else is doing so much better than you are. You put yourself on this hamster wheel, right? And you're never going to get on anything but that same wheel. But there's this wanting to do better and this comparison. But what people are missing is maybe, and I mean just maybe the people you're comparing yourself to aren't really the people you want to be, right? I mean, maybe we should focus on being who we are versus wanting what somebody else has, right? Because somebody else may have a whole lot of hidden problems that you don't know about that you're dreaming of getting, right? So just be careful of when you start thinking, well, if only I could be like the Joneses, right? And that's basically what this country is set up to be, is a comparative, capitalistic, everybody's out to claw their way to the top kind of thing. So in the U.S., we have incarceration, we have drug courts, we have ICE detentions, we have jail for addicts. Other countries like Portugal, they have decriminalization. So yeah, there's other things in other countries which are definitely higher as far as, I mean, the US is higher than the other countries. So, and also as far as drug overdoses, the US really rules as far as how many people are killing themselves, which is, these are really, if you look at society as a general, now I'm not some studied person from Harvard or something, but it appears to me things aren't going too well. Things aren't going too well. So anyway, so I have all this information down below for you to take a look at. So, and then looking at the addiction, the U.S. is a severe outlier, about 15 to 100 times higher overdose rates than most developed nations. And then we have the synthetic opioid-driven deaths. So this is where fentanyl comes in. And fentanyl had been flooding into this country like crazy. And oh, what a surprise. That has been on purpose. So anyway, so we got all these high overdose rates. Everybody's killing themselves on drugs. And why is all this? Why? So part of the reason, I mean, we get this direct to consumer advertising. Only the US and New Zealand do this. We have massive marketing to both doctors and patients. Big Pharma is heavily influenced in medical education. So, yeah, the fix is already in, right? Everybody's gearing toward this. But remember, they took away all the natural cures in the early 1900s. So, and because healthcare is a for-profit industry, which I find very interesting because most of these people dishing out healthcare are nonprofit, like a lot of hospitals and stuff are nonprofit, so they benefit by not paying taxes, but they also benefit by being a profit industry with the doctors, the insurance companies, and they all benefit from all these billable prescriptions, right? So anyhow, so yeah, everybody they say it's part of this quick fixing. I think part of that's probably true, but we also have mass trauma and mental health crisis. Don't forget all those orphan train children. Those kids came out of nowhere. They came out of Russia, so up through Ukraine. So they unleashed 300,000 or more children unsupervised. Talk about trauma when you don't even know who your parents are. So, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why this country is leading to trauma. And I'm certainly not saying any of this to say, oh, poor us, poor us. No, this country is an experiment. So I think that we should openly and with open eyes be looking at what are some of the effects. So for example, in the drug classes, opioids, the U.S. we're about 5% of the total population. We take over 80% of the world's pills. Same thing with ADHD meds. We take 90%. Antidepressants, the US takes 60% over other developed countries. We take 75% more calming agents like anxiety pills, like Ativan and Xanax. We take 50% of these statins, the cholesterol drugs, which obviously also make people very sick. So wherever you look, so 50% of the world's drug revenue and the highest consumption in the United States. So this is how it just didn't happen overnight, but people have become used to something's wrong, go to a doctor, they'll give you some pills. So how did all this get started? Well, interesting you should ask. Well, where did morphine come from? Well, morphine came from the 1800s to early 1900s. Morphine was isolated from opium in 1804 and became widely used during and after the American Civil War in the 1860s. So why did everybody start taking drugs after the Civil War? Good question, right? Because, I don't know, so much unsettlement, so many people were murdered, so many children were stolen. I don't know. So it was seen as a wonder drug and prescribed for pain relief, women's menstrual issues, and nervous disorders. By the late 1800s, it was called a soldier's disease. Morphine addiction among Civil War vets was recognized. Still, no federal drug laws existed. Morphine was sold in patent medicines, syrups, and tonics that anybody could really buy. So what about cocaine? Because we're really talking about uppers and downers, right? Morphine would be a downer, something that sedates you. Cocaine is an upper, keeps you up, talking. Yep, 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 yep. So, cocaine was isolated from cocoa leaves in the mid-1800s. Gee, why was that? All those centuries ago, they're talking about these thousands of years in that Bible and stuff. Not until the 1800s did cocaine come. That was used in toothache drops, asthma inhalers, and early versions of Coca-Cola until 1904. It was legal and praised by doctors, including Freud, for mental clarity and energy. Over time, concerns grew about addiction, erratic behavior, widespread use by laborers, sex workers, and minorities, which fueled moral panic. So the first major drug law, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, required accurate labeling of contents, including cocaine, opium, morphine, and alcohol. It was the first time the federal government intervened in drug labeling, but drugs were still legal. Then, in 1914, there was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. This was a turning point. Morphine, heroin, opium, and cocaine were no longer available over the counter. Framed as a tax law, but really used to restrict non-medical access. It required doctors and pharmacists to register and pay taxes to dispense narcotics. And that was just 1914. Over time, even medical access was tight. By the 1920s, it was nearly impossible to prescribe for addiction treatment. Driven partly by fears that black men on cocaine were violent, or Chinese immigrants on opium were corrupting white women. These racialized fears played a major role in prohibition. And this is the key to how psychopaths operate. They always will get the jump on the other guy. They will, right out of the chute, claim that all these black people are nothing but a bunch of loser addicts, when what they're really hiding is they themselves are taking all these drugs, right? But they're penning it on other people. Criminalization and the war on drugs, the 1930s to 70s. The 1930s, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by Harry Anslinger, demonizes drug use, linking it to immorality and crime, especially among minorities. 1950s, harsh sentencing laws were introduced. Isn't it interesting, right? They introduce the drugs and then they come up with ways to lock people up, right? 1970s, the Controlled Substances Act classified drugs into schedules, setting the stage for Nixon's war on drugs. And they still have, to this day, marijuana is in the category of heroin, I believe, still. Just as dangerous as heroin. So, okay, so 1804 to 1860s, morphine and cocaine were discovered and used legally in medicine. 1860s to 1900s, Civil War, morphine addiction, cocaine and Coca-Cola and patent medicines. 1906, Pure Food and Drug Act. 1914, begin criminalization. 1930s, full federal criminalization for drugs like heroin and cocaine were outlawed, 1930s and 70s. And then 1970s, Controlled Substances Act creates modern drug schedules, and morphine was a Schedule 2, and heroin was a Schedule 1 drug. So morphine and cocaine were legal, mainstream, and popular in the U.S. for decades. Criminalization came slowly, driven by a mix of medical awareness, racialized fears, and international diplomacy. What started as medicine ended up being framed as criminal behavior, especially for marginalized communities. When the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 and later laws made drugs like morphine and heroin illegal for non-medical use, demand didn't vanish. It just couldn't be met legally anymore. And here we have it. This created a lucrative black market with sky-high profit margins. Organized crime groups quickly realized illegality equals opportunity. So, enter the mafia, early 20th century, Italian-American mafia, the Chinese triads, and the Jewish gangs saw narcotics as even more profitable than alcohol. After Prohibition, which was 1920 to 1933, many crime families shifted from bootlegging alcohol to trafficking heroin and cocaine. So here we have, right there, the mafia enters the picture, right? The Sicilian mafia became especially influential in smuggling heroin from Turkey to France to the U.S., called the French Connection. But the mafia didn't invent the heroin trade, but they perfected its logistics, distribution, and political protection. So how'd this work? Well, from the 1930s to the 1970s, Turkey grew the opium, and labs in France refined it, and U.S. mobsters imported it. American mafia, like the Lucchesi and Gambino families, ran heroin rings in New York, Detroit, and Chicago. And you'll often read the mafia said, "We never sold any drugs. We didn't sell children or drugs." Well, that was a lie, and that's been proven to be a lie. So the high demand plus risk equal high reward. Some made millions of dollars per month. So very high profit, tiny packages, massive value, easy to smuggle. Addiction created constant customers. No taxes, no regulation, just raw cash. Addicts could be exploited. Dealers feared exposure. So the CIA and intelligence services were accused of allowing or ignoring drug trafficking in exchange for political favors, like the anti-communist operations. Nixon and Reagan's war on drugs cracked down on street-level users, but rarely hit the true top of the supply chain. Just like with prostitution, the prostitute goes to prison, the Johns or the people selling the prostitution don't have the same laws. It's just how they've rigged the system. So in the 1930s, the mafia begins narcotics trafficking as alcohol prohibition ends. So one bad deal enters a more lucrative deal, right? The 1950s to 1960s, the French Connection dominated the heroin trade into the U.S., thanks to Turkey and France. So 1972, they had the biggest heroin bust in U.S. history called the French Connection was busted. Well, what happened next? Well, then the Colombian cartels rose in the 1980s. Mafia influence shifts toward cocaine. So the mafia absolutely saw drug prohibition as a business opportunity. Once the state said no more legal morphine or heroin, crime families said, we'll supply it anyways, and built international empires. Prohibition didn't stop drug use. It made it more dangerous, more profitable, and handed control over to organized crime. Exactly how it all works, right? So this is an interesting trick they pulled because what they did was this. I call it the cheap mail trick. And here's how it worked. And this is about fentanyl. We're going to be talking about fentanyl now. Okay. So they exploited this loophole. International mail versus USPS. Under the Universal Postal Union, or UPU agreement, small international packages, especially those under 2 kilograms from developing countries like China, were shipped at subsidized rates. So this all came, you see all these shipments coming in from China now. If you buy things on eBay, the shipments will come in from China through the Postal Service because it was part of this postal system so that people from China could ship things here and get subsidized, right? Well, I took a back curve and a back flip when I figured out who is the universal postal system. Well, got news for you. It belongs to the UN. So, yeah, anyway, so what happened was the Universal Postal Union, and I'll be getting down to them in a bit here, they made small international packages. Those under 2 grams from developing countries were shipped at subsidized rates. So Chinese vendors, including drug traffickers, use this to ship fentanyl cheaply to the U.S. through the U.S. Postal Service, or the USPS. No signature, minimal customs, low cost. Quite a deal, right? The USPS lacked the customs data that private carriers like FedEx, UPS were required to collect, such as sender identity, origin, and package content. So if they moved it over to just USPS, which is just our general mail system here, it doesn't have any customs. So no one has to say what their identity is, where they're from, or what's in that package. Okay, nobody has to say anything. Okay, this is how how it got played. So it was an exploited loophole. International mail versus USPS. So, yeah. So the Universal Postal Union, or UPU, is the global body that historically sets the rules for international mail, including the cheap shipping rates that enabled fentanyl trafficking from countries like China to the U.S. via postal systems like the USPS. Imagine the work these people take, just up hours and hours and hours and days, all probably high on cocaine, cooking this stuff up. So who is the UPU? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Well, the UPU, or the Universal Postal Union, was founded in 1874 in Bern, Switzerland. So 192 countries, essentially every UN member state uses this UPU. So UPU became a UN specialized agency in 1948. Their main job is to coordinate drugs. I'm kidding. Their main job is to coordinate international postal policies, set terminal dues, shipping standards, tracking protocols, and customs framework. So obviously, these people knew what they were doing. At least that's how it appears to me. So the UPU, particularly for cross-border mail between national postal systems like China Post and the USPS, it historically allowed developing countries like China to pay lower terminal dues, meaning they could send packages to richer countries cheaper than domestic U.S. shippers could. And that was a big deal when I was selling on eBay because it kind of gave the U.S. sellers kind of an unfair advantage because they got all their shipping pretty much for free. So this group also creates barcoding, customs forms, labeling, electronic data sharing. So every country agrees to follow UPU protocols to ensure universal delivery of mail and parcels. Well, this all makes sense on a global basis, right? Until you get into the criminal part, right? And then it makes perfect sense, right? Because it makes a perfect sense because you got the fox back in the hen house, right? So it acts as a postal diplomatic forum. Regular congresses and technical committees set rules and rates by consensus or vote. So what happened was that the UPU, let me see here. So why did this matter for fentanyl? Well, it mattered a great deal. China, as a developing nation, under UPU rules, had deeply subsidized outbound shipping rates. U.S. mail carriers like USPS were obligated by treaty to develop incoming foreign mail even if underpaid. Minimal customs oversight was required for small, low-value packages often used for fentanyl or precursors. And also keep in mind, the person filling out the stuff, the anonymous person that they don't have to say where they're from or who they are, they're the ones that on that form declare the value, right? So they could be sending thousands of dollars worth of fentanyl and say, oh, $20 worth. So the fox is all the way in the hen house through this whole deal here. So, okay, so in 2018, the Trump administration announced it would withdraw the U.S. from UPU unless it changed how terminal dues were calculated. The argument was the U.S. was subsidizing China's e-commerce and drug trade. So UPU held an extraordinary Congress in 2019 in Geneva. The UPU backed down, allowing the U.S. to self-declare higher rates starting in 2020. This rebalanced cost, increased scrutiny, and closed much of the loophole, but not all of it. So that was the big loophole, right? Because what happened was it took away any advanced electronic data. There was little screening of small envelopes, low inspection rate, and cheap rates encouraged bulk shipping. So, with the UN, they prioritize equity for developing nations, not security or customs enforcement. See, there's the catch, right? It was prioritizing equity for developing nations, but they were not going to be doing security or customs enforcement, just basically giving them cheap postage, right? They shipped tons of fentanyl analogs cheaply while claiming to fight drug crime domestically. This legally bound by UPU treaty to deliver mail with limited inspection until they came up with this thing called Stop Act. So eventually they came up with this Stop Act, but it was because they couldn't inspect millions of small envelopes, no advanced electronic data pre-2019. So anyway, so Chinese traffickers could advertise fentanyl online, accept Bitcoin or gift cards, and ship a lethal dose in an envelope for under $5, arriving within 10 days. USPS would deliver it unopened, uninspected, and legally obligated. Add to that, pill presses, cutting agents, and precursors were also sent through mail or rerouted via Mexico. Who paid the price? Well, U.S. towns and cities ravaged by overdoses. Border agents and postal workers often were overwhelmed, sometimes sickened by exposure. Families searched for answers in a global trafficking problem enabled by multilateral bureaucracies and bad incentives. Today's UPU reforms help close that mail loophole. But now, okay, here's the catch. But now the same players are moving through Mexico. They're shipping the precursors and exploiting new gaps in air and sea cargo. So, how did this mail trick get started? Well, because there was an investigative report in 2016 and an NBC News show on 2017 titled How Chinese Drug Traffickers Make Billions Shipping Fentanyl to Americans. The impact: it exposed Chinese websites openly selling fentanyl using USPS delivery, even including customer reviews. NBC obtained actual mail packages and had them tested, so they confirmed it was fentanyl delivery through U.S. mail. And I believe this exposure happened because it was probably getting too hot in the kitchen. So they brought in their reporter friends. Oh, look, there's this big problem and China's out to get us, right? Never admitting all this UPU business, right? I never knew this UPU stuff until I looked into this stuff in the last couple of years. So, and then also the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal reported on the UPU terminal dues system and showed how China was paying less to ship packages to New York than a U.S. company could ship from LA to New York City. They called it an unintentional state subsidy for smugglers and counterfeiters. So then in 2018, the Senate finally woke up, and there was a report called Combating the Scourge of Opioid Trafficking Through the International Mail System. And this was led by Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. So staffers went undercover ordering fentanyl online from China, delivered through USPS. The report called the mail system the weakest link in America's drug control system. Gee, imagine that. They called it the weakest link in America's drug control system. I could be like overly suspicious. I mean, there's always that to be considered here, right? I could be either crazy or overly suspicious. But it certainly appears to me this weak link got put into there on purpose. But maybe it's just my suspicion. So that's how they found the flaw, okay? The reporters discovered that USPS was not required to collect electronic customer data before the STOP Act. So, who pushed for change? Well, they said it's unacceptable that while private carriers like FedEx and UPS are required to provide advanced data, USPS is letting this poison in through the front door. Well, yeah, I think that's the plan, not the bug in the system, right? So this one guy who was former DEA said, advocated for closing mail loopholes, warned about synthetic analogs. Yeah. Homeland Security, they did a report. They confirmed that less than 1% of international mail was okay. They confirmed that less than 1% of international mail was inspected in 2016 to 2017. So anyway, so it had to do with this thing. But basically, how it played out with this. The first report was 2016 and 2017. Then in 2018, the Senate did some undercover buys. 2018, the STOP Act passed, and that required USPS to collect electronic advanced data. In other words, tell us who you are, right? In 2020, enforcement begins, loophole narrows significantly. 2021 to 2025, trafficking shifts to Mexican land routes, but mail precursors shipping remains a risk. So basically, they shifted. The precursors are coming out of China, the stuff they're making this stuff with, right? So instead of mailing it here, they're just mailing it into Mexico, is how it appears to be operating. So, so that STOP Act was about global UPU reform. Kind of a little bit too late. So U.S. fentanyl-related deaths surged from 9,500 in 2015 to over 30,000 by 2017. So autopsy data and law enforcement seizures showed Chinese-sourced fentanyl arriving in manila envelopes. So that was how that got pulled. So Trump has been going back and forth. He made it a diplomatic issue in trade negotiations. And in August 2019, Trump announced that China would classify fentanyl as a controlled substance and crack down on exports, though enforcement was limited. Well, not much is being done about it. So how did they get caught? Well, they got caught by those journalists. Let's take a look at this loophole. So it's not really closed now as of I'm reading this. Many China sellers moved to Mexico-based operations, working with cartels to traffic fentanyl through land routes. Pill presses, precursors, and analogs can still be sent by mail, often misdeclared. The USPS now collects electronic data on over 90% of inbound mail, but enforcement still lags due to package volume and inspection staffing. So how long did this little trick work? Okay, so timeline 2013, fentanyl analogs began flooding in via China-based vendors. Deaths spike. U.S. authorities struggle to identify the source. Oh, I bet they did. So the next one, that was 2013 to 2015. Where's it coming from? In 2015, DEA journalists and customs began warning. They were warning Chinese fentanyl being mailed into U.S. via USPS with no advanced data, ultra cheap rates, and no action from UPU or the United Nations. So we started this whole little thing. I see 2013, now we're up to 2016. So they got a good 3 years in there, right? So then on 2017, they started getting reports in the news. And then 2018, late 2018, after years of denial and foot dragging, the U.S. forces UPU reforms and passes the STOP Act. And USPS begins to upgrade systems. So yeah, they got they started in 2013. They're still working on systems late 2018. They got a good 5 years in, right? So 2020 to USPS begins scanning inbound mail, and the cartels shift supply chain to Mexico. So yeah, it's still coming in. From early signs in 2013 to actual enforcement by 2020, there was a 7-year window where the cheap mail trick was well known but not acted upon forcefully. See, this sounds like a real pattern to me. How all these things get going, right? So they claim ignorance, legally obligated. Yeah, we got to keep shipping this stuff in. We can't stop it. So that was exactly how it all got going. So I'm going to put this on hold now. Okay, so where does this lead? Well, 3 to 4 years of known abuse before public exposure for fentanyl. 5 to 7 years before structural change. Hundreds of thousands were dead before it was acted on, and many, many more are dying right now. Synthetic opioids, mostly fentanyl, remain the leading driver, involved in roughly 68 to 73% of overdose fatalities. Next, and soon I'll be getting to the Gary Webb story and the Iran-Contra story and the drug trafficking route. So what I'm going to be closing up today are some details before I even get to the Peter Thiel case, because Peter Thiel and the Silicon Valley crowd, they're all about transhumanism, and they buy into this Huxley business. I've spoken about Huxley in the past. So what does it all mean? Well, Huxley actually predicted it. The U.S. is claiming that fentanyl is entering the U.S., yada, yada. In reality, it is always about their game of omission. It's a simple one in this case. They made shipments from China to the U.S. extremely cheap. This is the loophole. So just like opioids, they claim they didn't know what was going on. Then it turns out they were the ones who did it all along. Here, they stack the deck against black people by introducing crack cocaine in the late 70s. This is my generation. Us white kids would snort all the cocaine we wanted. So they spread crack cocaine for the black kids. Some people are still in prison today. Bottom line, it shows the racist nature of psychopaths running things. They made a lot of laws to imprison black people, and I don't know. I knew of one person that got in trouble, but they barely got in trouble. So they use crime to lock up black men. Then they claim they don't have any rights, so they're forced into slave labor. Seriously, nothing is hiding. When you in this country, in that 14th Amendment, what happens is this, is that when you are convicted of a crime, black or white, but it happens more to black people, all of your rights go away and you revert to slavehood. That was the catch in that amendment. There's always some catch in there, right? So that way they could get black men working for seriously $1 or $2 per day. The U.S. has more people in prison than any place they claim are so bad, worse than China or Russia. Just like the crack cocaine, opioids were even created the mafia. They just claimed they didn't know. It is ridiculous how simple it is to figure out the truth if you stick with my motto of always look for the beginning. Now, fentanyl is a boogeyman, and they can fix it today. Just fix the ability for people to have cheap shipping to here. Problem solved. Instead, Trump is claiming he is causing tariffs worldwide, and a big reason is fentanyl, which really isn't an issue if they did a simple thing. In the case of crack cocaine, it has been proven it was them that set it up because of how racist they all are. So Donald Trump even signed an executive order classified fentanyl as a WMD. It's very clear that the purpose of this hyperbolic executive order is a combination of designating fentanyl cartels as terrorist organizations, creating justifications for conducting military operations in Mexico and Canada, and creating justification for breaking up homeless encampments and deporting drug users who aren't or are citizens. This isn't the first time that fentanyl has been suggested as a WMD. In 2022, Florida Attorney General Ashley Moody pushed to classify fentanyl as a WMD, leading a bipartisan group of 18 state attorney generals in the effort. So, how does fentanyl affect the brain? Well, like heroin, morphine, and other opioid drugs, fentanyl works by binding to the body's opioid receptors, which are found in areas of the brain that control pain and emotions. After taking opioids many times, the brain adapts to the drug. diminishing its sensitivity, making it hard to feel pleasure from anything besides the drugs. When people become addicted, drug seeking and drug use take over their lives. Fentanyl effects can include extreme happiness, drowsiness, nausea, confusion, constipation, sedation, problems breathing, unconsciousness. People addicted to fentanyl who stop using it can have severe withdrawal symptoms that begin as early as a few hours after the drug was last taken. These symptoms can include muscle and bone pain, sleep problems, diarrhea and vomiting, cold flashes with goosebumps, uncontrollable leg movements, severe cravings. These symptoms can be extremely uncomfortable and are the reason many people find it difficult to stopping taking fentanyl. There are medicines being developed to help with the withdrawal process, but the FDA has approved a non-opioid medicine designed to reduce opioid withdrawal symptoms. Well, I would be very, very careful if I were to want to get off of these drugs before I would take another drug handed out by these people. So, where did we get fentanyl from? Well, it was invented by Dr. Paul Janssen, a Belgian pharmacologist and the founder of Janssen Pharmaceuticals. He developed it in 1960. Dr. Janssen was searching for a more potent and fast acting pain reliever to help patients undergoing surgery or suffering from severe pain, and he succeeded. Fentanyl turned out to be 100 times more powerful than morphine. It was first introduced as an intravenous anesthetic under the brand name Sublimaze in 1968. Over time, pharmaceutical companies developed other forms like patches, lozenges, and sprays for treating chronic pain in cancer patients and post surgical pain. Of course, it has low production costs. Fentanyl is synthesized from readily available precursor chemicals, making it cheaper to produce than plant based opioids like heroin. And ding, 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 there goes the bell, right? It is readily available from synthesized things. So, yes, no longer have to water those poppy fields now, do they? So, high potency is extreme potency means that a small amount can be divided into many doses, amplifying profits. Market value. Traffickers can press fentanyl into counterfeit pills or mix it with other drugs, selling them at prices comparable to less potent substances, thereby increasing profit margins. The illicit fentanyl trade generates significant revenue for criminal organizations. These profits are often laundered through complex international networks. For instance, Chinese money brokers have been implicated in laundering profits from U.S. fentanyl sales, facilitating intricate transactions that obscure the money trail. Rate of low cost shipping in fentanyl trafficking, we've already talked about that. U.S. tariffs. In response to the fentanyl crisis, the U.S. has imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, aiming to pressure China into strengthening its regulations on fentanyl production and export. Illicit fentanyl production is a different story. It's cheaper, faster, and way more dangerous. So here's how it works. They get the precursors from overseas, in other words, the things that go into it. Criminal labs are often linked to suppliers in China, Mexico, or India. They import chemical precursors, sometimes mislabeled to bypass customs. Backyard chemistry. Untrained chemists mix the precursors, often skipping safety steps. They may substitute harder to get chemicals with similar ones, producing fentanyl analogs like carfentanil, 100 times stronger than even fentanyl.
No quality control. The end product is crude and inconsistent. It makes it perfect for eugenics now, doesn't it? What do they care? What would they really care if you take a tiny dose or a big dose, right? The whole idea is to destroy us, right? And also along the way they get to crush your family while they're crushing the addicts, right? So pill pressing, illicit labs often press fentanyl powder into fake pills mimicking Oxycontin, Xanax, or other painkillers, making it hard to spot. Why is it so deadly? A tiny amount, or 2 milligrams, can be fatal. That's about the size of a few grains of salt. Since illegal fentanyl isn't mixed evenly, people often take too much without knowing it. So yeah, and that was exactly how they significantly flooded the market here, right? Um, I'm going to be scanning through here. Let me put this on hold for a second, real quick. So as of 2023, permanent scheduling of fentanyl analogs, Congress passed legislation making the class-wide ban on fentanyl analogs permanent. It closed loopholes that traffickers use by altering molecules slightly to evade specific drug bans. In 2024, Biden did an executive order. He directed Treasury and State Departments to target Chinese and Mexican chemical firms via sanctions. Biden enhanced customs and border protection powers to interdict suspect dual use chemicals. 2025, Trump did an executive order, Executive Order 14195. They did tariffs imposed on China imports tied to the synthetic opioid supply chain, which focused on precursor chemicals, lab equipment exports, Chinese companies allegedly enabling fentanyl production in Mexico. Well, I guess it sounds good that they're coming up with some things, right? But, of course, now that there's so much fentanyl on the streets, I'm really not really totally clear what any of this could possibly do to change anything. I pulled up all the statistics on overdose volumes and all that. I'm not going to go into all of it because I really don't believe that they're probably true, right? Um, Fentanyl is not as widely used recreationally as marijuana, cocaine, or alcohol because it's extremely potent and dangerous, often added to other drugs without the user's knowledge. So, yeah, accidental exposure. So, um, economics for cartels, fentanyl is cheap to make, highly potent, and easy to transport in small amounts. Cartels can earn millions from a kilogram, and it's easier to smuggle than bulkier drugs like cocaine. Unlike cocaine or heroin, fentanyl doesn't require crops, just chemical labs and precursors, making it a high profit, low risk product. So, yes, they're saying right now like 80% of people of overdoses are happening because of fentanyl. Fentanyl is the most dangerous drug on the market today due to its lethality, prevalence in counterfeit pills, and role in driving record breaking overdose deaths in the U.S. While it may not be the most commonly used or trafficked drugs by volume, it is the top threat to public health, law enforcement, and drug policy globally. Or how about is the top threat to people personally? So there's a strategic and economic link between the decline of the Afghan heroin after the U.S. withdrawal and rise of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, though it's not a simple one-for-one enforcement. But fentanyl filled the vacuum left by the disruption by traditional heroin markets. So because 2001 to 2021, the U.S. war in Afghanistan, Afghanistan was the world's largest producer of opium, shipping up to 85 to 90% of global heroin. The US and NATO never fully dismantled this trade. In fact, poppy production expanded during the occupation. Well, of course it did. Afghan heroin fueled global markets, Europe, Asia, but Mexican black tar heroin dominated the U.S. supply. So obviously, we already had a pretty good relationship with heroin coming from Mexico, right? Um, in April 2022, the Taliban officially banned opium poppy cultivation. Enforcement has been partial, but opium harvests have dropped significantly by 2023 and 2024. As Afghan heroin becomes scarcer and more expensive, global drug suppliers begin to shift towards synthetics. Unlike heroin, fentanyl is synthetic, cheaper, and not tied to geography. No fields, no harvest, just labs and chemicals. Mexican cartels, particularly CING and Sinaloa, scaled up fentanyl production using precursors from China and India. U.S. heroin overdose deaths have declined, while fentanyl deaths have exploded, especially since 2015, accelerating after 2020. Why it helped fentanyl replace heroin? Fentanyl is much cheaper to make, 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin. Doesn't rely on agriculture or war zones. Cartels control production start to finish. Opioid addicted users seek stronger highs or unknowingly consume fentanyl laced drugs. So, overall, the U.S. heroin use has dropped. Heroin seizures and overdose deaths in the U.S. has declined since 2016 and 2017. Just right about the time, right? Fentanyl has overtaken heroin almost completely in illegal opioid markets. Many fentanyl users never sought heroin. They consumed counterfeit pills like fake Percocets or Oxycontin laced with fentanyl. There's no hard evidence of a coordinated conspiracy to replace Afghan heroin with fentanyl, but the economic need for a new opioid source after the disruption of Afghan supply, China's chemical industry dominance, Mexican cartel logistics and control, U.S. opioid demand crisis, all aligned to create a synthetic solution in fentanyl. So, yeah, heroin's down, fentanyl's up, right? Um, and is coming up through Mexico. Let's talk about the speed. Where's the speed coming from? Well, ISIS is over there producing a drug called Captagon, and they're basically amphetamines. Some will get you up, some will get you down, right? But it's not fentanyl. And it's mostly in limited or tactical context. But ISIS and other groups in Syria and Iraq were linked to the production and smuggling of Captagon, a stimulant used by fighters and trafficked to the Gulf region. Captagon trade became a major funding source for warlords and militias, including pro Assad networks in Syria, not just jihadist groups. So, yeah, some militant groups loosely affiliated with jihadist ideologists have been involved in hashish or the opium trade, especially in Afghanistan, Mali, Libya, and West Africa. These are often tactical alliances using drugs to fund weapons and operations, not ideological acceptance of drug use. So, yeah, I think that ISIS is definitely involved in the Captagon. I couldn't find anything tying ISIS to the Mexican cartels, but just because nobody said, oh, ISIS is running this doesn't mean it's not running it, right? And I have information about the Sinaloa cartel. That's that El Chapo guy. That guy is, I don't know. you may want to believe these things are true, but I don't really, I don't believe it's really true. There's this one main role in Mexico, and it's a sing. It's a highly involved in trafficking fentanyl and distribution, rivaling the Sinaloa cartel in both volume and territory. So yeah, there's a lot. They're keeping it. You notice it's coming across the border, right? China and India are the main sources of precursor chemicals. These chemicals are shipped to Mexican ports, especially Manzanillo and Lazaro Cardenas, via legal front companies. Cartels then operate clandestine labs to synthesize fentanyl and press counterfeit pills like fake OxyContin or Xanax. So they're usually hidden in legitimate shipments like produce or auto parts, smuggled via tunnels, cars, and people across the U.S. Mexico border. Distributed domestically via U.S. based networks and street gangs. So, yeah, the Mexican gangs are running it, but I mean, who's running the Mexican gangs? Well, probably Washington, D.C., right? So, I have a lot more about the gangs down below if you want to look further. I'm going to be closing off this file now. What I'd like to close off, though, is I believe the U.S. is behind all drug trafficking. There, I've said it, okay? I have talked endlessly about, oh, this thing, that thing, Afghanistan, poppies, this, that, heroin. Yeah. The U.S. history of tolerating drug trafficking. We had the Golden Triangle, 1950s to 60s. That was when they were opium cultivation and trafficking with CIA air support. We had Laos and Air America, Vietnam War. The CIA operated Air America, a proprietary airline in Laos in Southeast Asia, to support anti communist militias. Numerous reports, including from journalists and whistleblowers, allege that Air America turned a blind eye to heroin trafficking by its allies, sometimes even transporting drugs inadvertently themselves. I don't think it was inadvertently, but then, of course, we had the Iran-Contras of the 1980s. The Reagan administration illegally sold weapons to Iran despite embargoes and used profits to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. The Contras, a U.S.-backed right-wing pre-military group, were heavily involved in cocaine trafficking. Investigative journalists like Gary Webb and DEA insiders alleged that U.S. agencies ignored or protected traffickers to keep the anti-communist war going. The CIA's own inspector general later admitted that the agency worked with individuals it knew were involved in drug trafficking. That period helped fuel the crack cocaine epidemic in U.S. inner cities. Then, of course, we have the Afghanistan and the Mujahideen in 1980 to 1990s. That was funneling weapons and cash through Pakistan's ISI intelligence service. Opium poppy production exploded in Afghanistan during this time, which was 1980s to 1990s. So, U.S. intelligence reportedly overlooked drug activity to maintain political alliances against the USSR, or so they say, right? Then, of course, there was Kosovo and the KLA, the 1990s NATO intervention. During the Kosovo War, the U.S. and NATO supported the Kosovo Liberation Army against the Yugoslavian forces. The KLA was linked to heroin and weapons trafficking through Europe and the Balkans. Western intelligence services were aware of this, but continued support to achieve geopolitical goals, breaking up Yugoslavia anti-Serb alignment. And then, of course, Mexico and the cartels, 2000 until present. While not officially sanctioned, the U.S. has tolerated massive cartel expansion. U.S. gun stores have armed cartels via the Fast and Furious style operations. American banks have laundered drug money with minimal prosecution, like the HSBC in 2012. U.S. political and law enforcement priorities focus on immigration and border optics, not dismantling the economic structures of trafficking. DEA agents have leaked internal frustrations about being ordered to ignore high-level cartel actors tied to state power. So the U.S. has repeatedly tolerated or cooperated with drug traffickers when it served broader objectives, especially during the Cold War. From Golden Triangle heroin to Iran-Contra cocaine and today's look-away policy on cartel-driven fentanyl, the pattern is clear. Drug trade becomes strategically acceptable if it aligns with geopolitical goals. And of course, we had Operation Condor, 1975 to 1989, a U.S. backed South American intel. I think you're getting my point here, right? Countries involved: Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, later Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. With transnational corporation, military juntas shared intel and coordinated arrests and killings. They disappeared persons. Tens of thousands were tortured, executed, or vanished without a trace. The U.S. role: declassified documents from the CIA and State Department confirm the U.S. knew about Condor and supported many regimes involved. Henry Kissinger's State Department repeatedly discouraged investigations into Condor killings. Ties to drug trafficking. In several cases, regimes involved in Condor also used drug smuggling to fund intelligence operations. Notably, in Bolivia, where narco traffickers worked closely with military intelligence, especially under Luis Garcia Mesa's narco regime, 1980 to 1981. So, estimated 60,000 plus victims, deepening U.S. reputation for complicity in state terror and authoritarianism in Latin America. It laid the groundwork for paramilitary criminal fusion seen today in countries like Colombia, Mexico. Gee, imagine this. And now Mexico, let me get this straight. Now Mexico is now cleaning up the mail deal and they're taking the burden of the stuff here. Okay, so, and this is how it all got started, right? Oh, we're going to change this all around. Sure you are, right? Then they had Operation Fast and Furious, 2006 to 2011. The U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Let me see. The operation that deliberately allowed illegal gun sales in the U.S. to proceed so the weapons could be traced to Mexican drug cartels, but the guns were never properly tracked. Whoops. Yeah, that was a deal where they identify and dismantle cartel gun trafficking networks. But in practice, ATF lost control of nearly 2,000 firearms, many of which turned up in violent crimes, including the murder of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry in 2010, numerous killings in Mexico. Massive scandal erupted after whistleblowers exposed the program. Internal DOJ memos showed high-level awareness, but poor oversight. Attorney General Eric Holder was held in contempt of Congress, first in U.S. history for a sitting AG for failing to provide documents. Many Mexicans saw this as U.S. complicity in cartel violence, especially since no major cartel leaders were arrested throughout the operation. Pattern of impunity: no high-ranking U.S. officials were prosecuted. Program was quietly ended. Media coverage faded. Weapons continued to surface at crime scenes in Mexico years later. Well, it kind of sounds to me like if I'm going to say right now that I think the U.S. is in all this drug stuff, well, I don't know. They seem like they're pretty tight with Mexico, and Mexico's the one bringing in the fentanyl now, and fentanyl is their biggest tool for further eugenics, right? How can they kill off more of us? Well, they got fentanyl, right? So these operations show how U.S. foreign and domestic power structures have historically enabled or directly supported violence and criminality, either in the name of fighting communism or stopping drugs in both cases. Real accountability was absent. Victims were largely non US citizens. The operations backfired or produced blowback. So, um, supposedly the CDC is keeping track of deaths. They say there's over 400,000 deaths since 2013 to 2024. I wouldn't get too wrapped up in any of these numbers because with the opioid crisis, thanks to the Sackler family, a lot of those people did not get written off as dead from the opioids. They got killed by other things, like when they became heroin addicts, when they couldn't get the opioids and their life spiraled into poverty. So I don't think these numbers are anything to get too riled up over because I think they're probably way too low. So, according to the CDC, research tracking synthetic opioid deaths over the past decade is what they say. 2013, 3,000, 2014, 5,000, 2015, 9,500, 2016, 19,000, 2017, 28,000 deaths. Yeah, the deaths are certainly ratcheting up, right? 2018, 31,000. 2019, 36,000. 2020, 57,000. 2021, 71,000. 2022, 73,000. So no matter what you think, the deaths are on the rise, right? And I think the number is too low. But fentanyl has overtaken all other drugs in overdose deaths, including heroin, cocaine, meth, and prescribed opioids. Many of these deaths occur from accidental exposure. Users believe they're taking Oxycontin, Xanax, or heroin, but receive fentanyl laced counterfeits. Fentanyl is involved in over 70% of total drug overdose deaths in the U.S. as of 2023. Pretty high number, if you ask me. So, fentanyl deaths are also rising in Canada since 2016. Europe, still slow but growing. Australia, New Zealand, presence but growing slowly. And then we have the Captagon. That's mainly being run out of ISIS. It's called serious war drug. Originally developed in the 1960s as a treatment for ADHD and narcolepsy, banned in most countries by the 1980s, now used as a powerful illicit stimulant, often falsely labeled as Captagon, but typically made from amphetamine and caffeine or similar compounds. So, yeah, they used it to keep the fighters awake, the ISIS militants to boost aggression during attacks. Also a major cash crop. Syria's Captagon industry is estimated to be worth billions annually, helping prop up what's going on over there. I couldn't find any connection between the Captagon trade and the fentanyl epidemic, but I'm just starting looking. You don't know. I'm still looking, okay? So, in essence, Captagon is not a form of fentanyl, it's an upper. Fentanyl is what I would call a downer. It is a Mideastern illicit stimulant produced largely in Syria and used in both warfare and party culture. Whereas fentanyl is a deadly synthetic opioid flooding Western markets, especially the U.S., through China, Mexico to U.S. supply chain. Both represent the weaponization of drugs in global politics, but in very different ways. Captagon is not officially a eugenics tool, but it's important to look at what it's actually used for, because it's militarized performance enhancement, addiction-driven social control, increasingly seen in states with weak public health infrastructure. So I believe it's being used as a eugenics tool because flooding, let me see, flooding poor or rebel communities with addictive or harmful drugs has been used historically to weaken populations and neutralize resistance. Similar to how opium was used in China in the 19th century, or crack in the U.S. inner cities in the 1980s. Captagon may function as a weapon of class warfare or geopolitical suppression. So, and where does this come from? Well, it's part of a bigger historical trend where drugs and social engineering intersect, and powerful regimes use addiction, psychological trauma, and chemical control as tools, not just of warfare, but of demographic engineering. Aldous Huxley explicitly predicted and warned of a future in which drugs would be used to pacify and control populations, making people easier to manage without the need for brute force oppression. This theme is central to his dystopian novel Brave New World from 1932 and echoed in his later public talks and essays, especially Brave New World Revisited in 1958. In Brave New World, the population is pacified not through fear or violence, as in Orwell's 1984, but through pleasure, distraction, and chemical sedation. Citizens consume a government distributed drug called Soma. It provided bliss, compliance, and emotional numbness. People take it when they're upset, rebellious, or non productive. No withdrawal, no critical thinking, no revolution. The result, a docile, chemically managed society where people are conditioned to love their servitude. There is always soma, delicious soma, half a grain for half holiday, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous East. Huxley warned Huxley warned that the future would likely combine pharmacological control with mass propaganda. There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies. The population would be conditioned to enjoy their servitude by way of brainwashing enhanced by drugs, suggestion, and propaganda. Huxley predicted widespread use of mood altering drugs, governments encouraging or mandating their use. A world in which obedience is chemically induced, not forced. Many see parallels in today's world. We have antidepressants, anti anxiety meds, ADHD stimulants are widely prescribed and overprescribed. Recreational drug markets, legal and illegal, soothe unrest from and distract from deeper systemic issues. Opioid epidemics, like with fentanyl, shows how entire communities can be chemically disabled while political and economic systems remain unchallenged. Aldous Huxley foresaw a future where drugs would be central to society control, not through punishment, but through pleasure, sedation, and emotional engineering. He believed that mass pacification through chemistry would become more effective than fear or violence, and that people would not realize they were being controlled because they would enjoy it. And I'll be talking soon about modern transhumanism, so I'll just set the stage here. Promoted by figures like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Ray Kurzweil, traces its philosophical roots back to Aldous Huxley's world, but not in the way he intended. Huxley warned of a techno dystopia. Thiel and modern transhumanists are trying to build. So the link between Huxley and transhumanism. So Julian Huxley, who was Aldous's brother, coined the term transhumanism in 1951. Julian Huxley was also a British eugenicist, evolutionary biologist, and UNESCO's first director general. In his vision, transhumanism meant the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, but in its entirety as humanity. We need a name for this new belief. Perhaps transhumanism will serve. He believed in guiding evolution through science, blending eugenics, psychology, and technocracy. Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World as a warning against the exact kind of techno utopian thinking. Well, his brother wrote one book against it, the other book for it. I think they just were presenting two sides of the same coin. So, Peter Thiel, a libertarian leading billionaire and co founder of PayPal and Palantir, he supports life extension research, chironics, anti aging biotech, and he has transhumanist goals of post human intelligence. So, and he has funded a lot of this, and I'll be getting back to more about that later. But this whole idea came from the Huxleys, and I already did a show about them, so I'm not going to wade all the way in there right now. But basically, this idea about transhumanism, man self transcends through science and reason. He wrote openly in favor of eugenics, even post World War II, believed in improving the human race through genetic control and selective breeding. Here we go again, right? So, anyway, so I've already covered enough about the Huxleys. I do have more about him down below. I'll have a link to the show I did about him. So, transhumanism directly descends from Julian Huxley's ideology, which his brother Aldous warned against in Brave New World. Peter Thiel and others are building systems of biological control, enhancement, and immortality for the elite, which can create radical inequality and technocratic domination, all while being framed as freedom or evolution. So, yes, that is a goal. And I guess the idea is to just pour drugs everywhere. It could be a mix of things. I think they're just recklessly making sure everybody can get their hands on drugs because unless you don't have half a brain, anybody can figure out these days how to go online and order drugs, right? And speaking of drugs, I would suggest, just a gentle suggestion, hospitals are going to be closing down. Maybe some drugs you may need. You may consider getting what you need. I don't know. Completely up to you. So, yeah, so I believe this is all being run by the U.S. They have a history of it. They've been involved in all of these different things. I have most of them listed down below if you take a look at. This is about me sharing my work, but it's also about you deciding for yourself, what does it all mean to you? I think it means that by hook or by crook, they want our souls, right? And probably there's some benefit to getting people all jacked up on drugs because you probably commit illegal things. You probably do things you wouldn't do normally. So when you're out of your mind on drugs and alcohol, probably another way they can capture souls, right? Get you to take a bunch of drugs, get you to go over the dark side. Yeah, that's how I think it could be working out. So anyhow, I really need to close off this file. I've gone way too long today. So be safe out there and goodbye for now.